Welcome, everyone. My name is Stacy Mook, and I'm a professor in the Department of Political Science and Public Administration. I'm excited to welcome you today to our upcoming webinar, Mass Incarceration, Policy Landscape in Alabama. Today's webinar is made possible by the Office of Public Health Practice, the Public Health Student Association, the Lister Hill Center for Health Policy, and the Institute for Human Rights. Each of these sponsors is offering interesting and informative virtual events all semester long. You can check out their websites and social media for updates. Mass incarceration is not just a criminal justice issue. It is a health and human rights issue. Entire populations of people are targeted by this practice, and communities have been oppressed by mass incarceration for decades. To walk us through what this issue looks like in Alabama, we have Dillon Nettles and Katie Glenn with us today. Dillon Nettles joined the ACLU of Alabama in 2018 as policy analyst. In this role, Dillon manages the ACLU's legislative portfolio and engagement with lawmakers and other public officials. In addition, Dillon is responsible for providing strategic guidance on policy, advocacy initiatives, campaigns, and communications. Prior to joining the ACLU, Dillon focused on public education policy and community engagement strategy in the Montgomery community. He founded Forward South in 2017, a digital platform dedicated to telling the stories of transformative game changers in the Deep South, past and present. Dillon has been recognized as a Clinton Global Initiative alumnus, New Profit Millennial Impact Fellow, and Digital Leaders Fellow by Students for Education Reform. Katie Glenn is a native Alabamian and policy associate at the Southern Poverty Law Center. There, she helps lead the center's policy work in Alabama, focusing on legislative advocacy, direct lobbying, coalition building, and community engagement. About half of the year, she spends her days, and far too many of her nights, at the Alabama State House, working on issues related to the center's main focus areas: criminal justice reform, children's rights, economic justice, immigrant justice, LGBTQ rights, and voting rights. Prior to her time at SPLC, Katie worked at Planned Parenthood Southeast, Voices for Alabama's Children, Birmingham Southern College, and the United States Department of Health and Human Services. We are so delighted to have these panelists with us today, and I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to them.
Thank you so much for having us here today, Stacy. We are so excited to be with you. Like Stacy said, my name is Katie Glenn. Just a quick reminder, if you've got questions, we are going to run through our presentation, but please put them in the Q&A box. We will answer as many of them as we can at the end of the presentation. If we don't get to your question, we'll do our best to get you an answer. Thank you so much to all 130 plus of you who are here with us today. Special shout out to my mom who's out there in the Zoom audience. We are so thankful to spend an hour with you. I want to first start by setting a few ground rules, talking through a few key players and some terminology. There's a lot to discuss when it comes to the landscape of mass incarceration in Alabama. There's that famous quote about how history doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme. Everything we're going to talk to you about today could be talking about what happened in the 1980s in Alabama when it comes to prisons and mass incarceration, the 70s, the 60s. All of this has happened time and time again. This is all incredibly cyclical. The same ideas, the same mistakes have happened time and again. So we've chosen a specific time period to talk about what's happening now, but there certainly is more that's happened. There are certainly other experts you can talk to, certainly a lot of people with a diverse set of experiences, and we would encourage you to speak to them as well about this. So just very quickly running through some terminology. First, directly impacted. What does that mean? That's a word you're going to hear us say. It means different things to different people. Our good friend, Pastor Kenny Glasgow, would remind us that we're all directly impacted by the criminal justice system and mass incarceration in Alabama. But most typically what it means is people who are either currently incarcerated themselves, formerly incarcerated, or have family members who are currently or formerly incarcerated. ADOC is the Alabama Department of Corrections. That is the state entity that oversees all of the prisons and prison-related entities in Alabama. BPP is sometimes conflated as both the Alabama Bureau and the Alabama Board of Pardons and Paroles, but most typically means the Alabama Bureau of Pardons and Paroles. Jeff Dunn is the commissioner of the Alabama Department of Corrections. Charlie Graddick is the director of the Bureau of Pardons and Paroles. I didn't put Lee Gwathney on there because we probably won't say her name quite as much, but she is the chair of the Board of Pardons and Paroles. We will get to the distinction between those two groups shortly. Kay Ivey is the governor of Alabama. Steve Marshall is the attorney general of the state of Alabama. One other name that I forgot to put on there is Cam Ward. He is the chair of the Alabama Senate Judiciary Committee. Anybody I left off, Dillon?
No, I think you got to all the major players.
Awesome. All right, I'll throw it to you.
Sure. So thank you all for the introduction, and thank you, Katie, for covering those kind of key terms and key players. As was previously stated, I'm Dillon. I'm a policy analyst at the ACLU of Alabama, and I have the real pleasure of getting to work kind of day in and day out with Katie, my counterpart over at the center. And so excited to be going through this presentation together. It's so much of our work that we embark on a day-to-day and week-to-week. So we really want to start this presentation by talking about the 2016 nationwide prison strike. The truth is that in this work, we battled with reminding leaders and decision makers of the humanity of every person incarcerated and formerly incarcerated. Those are the directly impacted people that Katie just spoke about. And the truth is that no one really better understands the complexities of the criminal legal system than those very individuals that are most directly impacted by it. And so we felt it was really only right that we start this presentation really centering their activism and their work in this. And the 2016 nationwide prison strike was really started from right here in our home state of Alabama. So on September 9th of 2016, incarcerated individuals around the country staged what was a coordinated strike to mark the 45th anniversary of the bloody uprising at Attica Prison in New York. And more than 24,000 people incarcerated are believed to have participated in this strike across 12 states. And it's really hard to actually get a solid number. It's likely much higher, but it really came down to states reporting if essentially the people who are incarcerated were kind of complying or showing up for quote unquote work. This is really just unpaid labor. And so that's the estimate that we have. But the strike was organized at Holman Prison in Alabama with a group of incarcerated individuals known as the Free Alabama Movement. And while demands differed from state to state, they largely focused on fair pay, humane living conditions, and better access to education and rehabilitative programming. Incarcerated organizers have long been signal boosting the violence, abuse, and threats faced due to overcrowding and mass incarceration in Alabama's prisons. And according to the Free Alabama Movement, slavery is still alive and well in the Alabama prison system today, which I think is really important to uplift. So I'm going to walk back just slightly here because we want to talk about in 2015 what happened, which was the legislature adopted a reform package with the goal of strengthening community-based supervision and treatment and prioritizing prison space for people with, and I'll say this in quotes, violent and quote, dangerous offenses. Those are not terms that I would necessarily use, but you're going to, as we get deeper into this, understand why those are not necessarily descriptive of these actual charges or offenses. So this process was called Justice Reinvestment, which was done in hand with the Council for State Governments. And we saw reforms in this legislative package include things like several frequently charged low-level drug and property offenses. They were now, after this reform package, classified as a Class D felony offense, which was a new classification, and it carried a max sentence of 5 years. So you can kind of imagine that it's taking some of these charges and putting them into a new classification with a different maximum sentence, with the goal of keeping those individuals from staying for really long, lengthy sentences incarcerated. But it also mandated evidence-based guidelines for both docketing and release by the parole board, and we're going to talk much more about the parole board later. And it also capped incarceration for technical violations, which can be a range of things that are that can essentially get you reincarcerated because you are in violation of your probation or parole. There was a number of other things that were included. I won't kind of go into all of the details, but those were some of the big picture items. According to a report by the Council of State Governments, this would lead to project a reduction of 16% or 4,243 people in Alabama's prison system at that time. It also called for an $152 million reinvestment in supervision, treatment, and support for victims from fiscal year 2016 through fiscal year 2021. The truth is that Alabama's leaders failed to fully commit to this vision, and in the years following, they really undercut even some of these reforms with reactive and overly punitive policies and decisions that were also made at the pardons and paroles level. And in addition, several key components were really missing from the justice reinvestment process. They really missed the chance, unfortunately, to bring some hard-hitting reforms that could have dramatically impacted sentencing, things like repealing or modifying Alabama's 3 strikes law, and we're going to talk more about that too, or making sentencing guidelines that they did in fact change retroactive so that actually people who had already been sentenced pre-2015 would then have their cases or their charges re-looked at and could be re-sentenced, possibly even released if under the new sentencing guidelines, they would see a reduction in their sentence.
Awesome. Thank you, Dillon. So Sarah, thank you so much for your question in the chat about the DOJ reports. You must have looked at our slides in advance to know what was next. So in April of 2019, the Department of Justice, under the leadership of William Barr, released a report saying that Alabama's male designated prisons, so this report left out Tutwiler, which is the one female designated prison in the state of Alabama, were unconstitutional for several reasons, right? They focused on violence and sexual abuse, as well as the fact that ADOC had failed to provide safe conditions of confinement. There was a lot of confusion when this was released. People thought that this meant that the federal government was coming in to take over, that the federal government was suing the state of Alabama. That's not what it meant. This was just the first step in another potential series of steps. This was just the federal government putting the state of Alabama on notice, saying, we see these issues exist, detailing them in very fine details, pointing out where those issues were and saying, if you don't do something about them, then the federal government could act. So what did they find? Extreme overcrowding and understaffing. At the time of the report, Alabama's prisons were around 182%, at 182% overcrowding. So that means that, you know, a prison built to house 100 people would have 182 people in it. And at the same time, they had about a third of the staff needed, while 3 of the facilities had less than 20% of the staff needed. Simultaneously, they found high rates of abuse, drugs, and violence, specifically sexual abuse and sexual violence, often perpetrated by guards and correctional officers. One might ask where these drugs are coming from. These people are incarcerated. Why do they have drugs in prison? I would point out to you that the only people who are allowed to come into prison facilities in the state of Alabama without being searched are correctional officers. So much of the contraband that was found, that was mentioned in these reports, has to be coming in somewhere. And it's not coming in from the family members and the individuals who, you know, are searched on the way in. And that was the point of one of the governor's study group's meetings, which Dillon will get to shortly. We'll talk about those in a bit. So after this report was released, it caused quite a stir at the State House. This was in the middle of the 2019 legislative session. And it gave the state of Alabama 49 days basically to react. Unfortunately, not a lot came of it, right? We left that legislative session without major reforms, with a promise of a special session down the road. But that's basically what they did. They kicked the can down the road and said we would do something in the fall. I'm going to copy and paste a summary of this 2019 report that our colleagues over at Alabama Appleseed did, so you can read an 8-page version of it instead of a 40, 50-page version of it, in case you're interested. Dillon, can you go to the next slide? So one thing that actually did happen during the 2019 legislative session that was not massive reforms to Alabama's criminal justice system was a huge rollback on parole. So what is parole? There are certain people who are incarcerated in the state of Alabama who are eligible for parole, which means that based on your type of sentence, you can be released before the end of your sentence and go and have the rest of your sentence, so you're still under increased supervision, in the community. You have certain reporting requirements. You may have to go visit with a parole officer more frequently. You may have to check in with certain things with your employment, with drug tests, etc. It's not just going home and living your life regularly. It is still a type of supervision. It's just performing that in the community. So in the summer of 2018, a man who was previously incarcerated was released on parole and unfortunately killed 3 people. And as the Alabama legislature is wont to do, in response to that, in reaction to that, they drafted a piece of legislation called HB 380 that drastically rolled back our ability to allow people to be released on parole in Alabama. It completely restructured the way the board and Bureau of Parole works and put a new person in charge of it all. Why is that important? Good legislation is not reactionary legislation. Good legislation is data-driven, it is evidence-based, and it is not based on one singular incident. But unfortunately, and you'll hear legislators on both sides of the aisle decry this, in the state of Alabama, we love reactionary legislation on a host of issues. And so HB 380, among many things, put a man named Charlie Graddick, an old judge from Mobile, in charge of the Bureau of Pardons and Paroles. It made it a cabinet level position that reports directly to the governor. Judge Graddick is best known for being a former attorney general who used to say that you should take people who are eligible for the death penalty and fry them until their eyeballs pop out. And so that's his sort of, the lens through which he views the criminal justice system. So he became director of the Bureau of Pardons and Paroles on September 1st and immediately canceled every parole hearing that was on the books. That means, I think it was over 700 people had hearings set. They were all canceled. His reasoning was around victim notification laws that he said were not being followed. So all these folks who were in line, who thought that they had been taking the classes that were required of them, who had been doing their best to follow all of the rules that had been set for them, had their chances at being released on parole wiped away. Parole hearings resumed in November at a trickle. They were releasing people at much, much, much lower rates compared to previous years. Then COVID hit. They canceled parole hearings once again. And when parole hearings resumed in May, there were a series of reports that my colleagues here at SPLC did that showed great racial disparities in the people who were being released on parole. White people were something like 2.5, 3 times more likely, white men specifically, to be released on parole than Black men. So it is just a real mess and has some real implications for the racial biases inherent in the criminal justice system in Alabama with what is happening in our parole system. I'm going to drop 3 things in the chat when it comes to parole. The first is an ACLU report, just generally on the backlog of parole and what that means for the general prison population, because as I mentioned, in the 2019 DOJ report, we were at 182% overcrowding. What does that mean when we're canceling hundreds and hundreds of parole hearings and then not letting anyone out when we have parole hearings once again? I'm going to drop in a report from SPLC about racial bias in parole hearings, and then another report about parole hearings for older folks amongst COVID, because one of the recommendations from public health experts at the beginning of COVID, one of the best things we can do, as Stacey mentioned, mass incarceration is a public health issue. One of the best things we can do is release older folks to their homes, to their communities, to live the rest of their lives. And that's not what's happening in Alabama, and it's having some real impact. So now I think Dillon is going to talk a little bit about the study group that I mentioned briefly.
Sure, and while you're adding those links, I'll just also mention really quickly on this piece, and you got at this, Katie, but one of the things we hear again from directly impacted voices, people both in the inside and their concerned family members right now about this crisis around parole, is that they're losing hope. They're losing any sense of optimism that one day their loved one will come home, or that they themselves will be back out into their community and reunited with their family and loved ones again. And so you can imagine what that does in already overcrowded and really poor conditions inside these facilities for a person's morale and kind of attitude. And so I just wanted to mention that really quickly before we move on. So Katie referenced the governor's study group earlier. Following the release of the first DOJ report in April 2019 and the passage of HB 30, which was this massive parole shift that Katie just talked about, Governor Ivey convened the Criminal Justice Study Group to form research and recommendations on Alabama's toughest challenges in the legal system. This group was comprised of former Alabama Supreme Court Justice Champ Lyons, who actually chaired the study group, Attorney General Steve Marshall, and members of the Senate and House of Representatives. Katie mentioned earlier, Senator Cam Ward was one of those members, also Representative Chris England. These are two people who've been, very outspoken and are kind of some of the leaders when it comes to some of these conversations within the legislature, for good or for bad. So I just wanted to point that out. On January 29th, the study group finalized their recommendations, which included a number of things. First was actually creating some form of legislative oversight over the Department of Corrections, which could look like reporting and just the legislature actually gathering more information about what is actually happening inside the facilities. It also included increased appropriations for treatment, rehabilitation, medical services, contraband detection, some sentencing changes, reducing some initiatives in particular to reduce recidivism rates, and the expansion of the Stepping Up initiative, which is a successful nationwide program managed at the state and local level with the goal of reducing the number of people incarcerated with mental illness. The Alabama Department of Mental Health actually manages this program, and it launched in 2019 in a few different counties throughout the state. A final kind of recommendation that was affirmed in this report was a further study of community corrections, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about on our next slide. But the group actually convened monthly from July 2019 all the way through January of this year. And in that time, unfortunately, with the exception of when Governor Ivey came to introduce the study group, she was no longer present at another meeting. And Attorney General Steve Marshall, who has actually had a seat on the study group, never attended a meeting as a member of that group. So we are going to take a slight detour here and talk a little bit about community corrections and recidivism, because I know that there are some students listening who have a real interest in this topic and are even involved in some reentry work. So just to describe a little bit more about community corrections, this is an umbrella term for alternative courts, which could be drug courts, veterans courts, mental health courts, and the pretrial diversion programs. And these are, again, pretrial. So these are actually programs for people who have not yet actually even been officially sentenced. And so these are administered by district attorneys' offices and municipal governments oftentimes, and they hold enormous potential for the state because they can actually steer what are considered low-level offenders into programs that address underlying factors that contribute to what some folks consider criminal activities. So these can be things like substance abuse, lack of educational attainment, and lack of employment. The governor's study group urged lawmakers to review successful alternative courts and diversion programs across the state that work well and help divert people from incarceration or recidivation. But in many places, these programs are unavailable, underfunded, or simply inaccessible. There are also serious concerns about the kind of pay to play, if you will, nature of these programs, which has been something that even Senator Ward himself has talked about. He has been open about using a diversion program in his own instance, and about how that was something that he could afford to do, but oftentimes these programs are not affordable, and if they're accessible at all. So basically in Alabama, there's no statewide infrastructure for reentry, so every jurisdiction is handling it a bit differently, if they're doing it at all. And Alabama's recidivism rate is just above 30%, which isn't the highest in the country, but it's definitely far from the lowest. And we believe that number should come down quite dramatically. So after this study group convened or finished convening, and they, as I just mentioned, issued their recommendations at the end of January, we started, a couple of weeks after that, Katie, our 2020 legislative session. And, of course, we came in with a lot of energy and focus on taking the momentum that had really been built over the course of months as the study group convened. I mentioned to you earlier that those meetings had occurred over about a 6-month span of time. And for each of those meetings, our organizations, we were present, but we worked really hand in hand with the Alabamians for Fair Justice Coalition. You'll see them in some of the slides later on here. And we wanted to make sure that criminal justice reform was a centerpiece of the 2020 legislative session. Some of our top priorities included things like sentencing reform, which included a repeal of Alabama's Habitual Felony Offender Act. It's also known as a 3 strikes law. And so most states, you probably are all familiar with some form of a 3 strikes law. Limiting pretrial detention, I talked about that on the last slide, and then mental health and substance abuse treatment services, which we've also touched on. We really also urged lawmakers to ease barriers to reentry. And so these were some of the top line items for us from our respective organizations and in partnership with our coalition, Alabamians for Fair Justice. But what actually happened? The truth is that prior to the legislature shutting down, they did file some bills that we were happy to see at least finally land, but they didn't go far enough, and they didn't even encapsulate some of those priorities I just mentioned, or a lot of things that we had been urging lawmakers for months. And at these study group meetings, we attended every single one to try to show that, in fact, there were impacted people in the room who lawmakers could turn and listen to. And instead, they selected at each of those meetings kind of state entities or the kind of typical voices, people that they could talk to, frankly, any day of the week. Took up a lot of time in those study group meetings instead of the people who, again, are most impacted by these policies. So what they did file were some bills to raise thresholds on certain offenses, like property theft offenses. So raising threshold would mean that there would be a higher amount that one would have to, or a higher value for property that one would have to meet before, say, it becomes a higher classification of a felony offense. They also provided more legislative oversight of ADOC, which was, as we mentioned, a key component of some of the previous reforms, even going back to 2015, or recommendations rather. They filed a bill that would have appointed a commissioner for rehabilitation within the Alabama Department of Corrections, and also one that would have incentivized successful completion of the little programming that is made available through ADOC, and that would have ultimately calculate into good time that might lead to a sentence reduction or early release. And so again, some positive movement, but still not the type of big reforms that we really need to see to actually tackle what is this challenge of mass incarceration.
Thanks, Dillon. I was just laughing because Ian's question in the chat was, are we going to talk about prison construction? Because y'all are ahead of the game today.
I'm excited.
I know. Y'all did your homework. So there have been several attempts in the past, as I mentioned. None of this is new ideas or information to build new prisons in Alabama. Governor Bentley had his Alabama Prison Transformation Initiative. I emphasize that because that's going to sound familiar in a minute. It failed legislatively. There are a couple other attempts. Most of the legislative attempts failed because legislators couldn't agree on a couple of things. One, which prisons would close because that means jobs would leave their district, or 2, where the new prisons would be built, because that means they would get new jobs and economic incentive in terms of construction jobs in their district. And so the governor decided that she was going to go about this extra legislatively and just do it herself. And for a long time, this was the best kept secret in politics. None of us could get any information. And, you know, I think Dillon and I are relatively good at our jobs, but we work with a lot of people who are much better than us at getting information in politics, and they couldn't get any information on exactly how the governor was going to go about this, exactly where the prisons were going to go, and exactly who was involved. It was kept very close to the vest. And it wasn't until the last couple of weeks that this information really came out, when y'all saw it just about the same time we did, which is sort of unusual. But the way that this is supposedly going to work, there's a really big asterisk at the end of this, is that there are going to be 3 new prisons built by private companies that the state will lease from them for 30 years. And as Representative England pointed out, the state cannot legally engage in a 30-year lease, so it will be 31-year leases, 31-year leases. There are 2 private companies that Governor Ivey announced that the state is going to engage with. One is CoreCivic. You're probably familiar with CoreCivic because they have run many horrific immigration detention facilities across the country. There's some in Wyoming, there's some in the Southeast. I know there's some in Tennessee that have gotten them into hot water. That is the name that you are likely familiar with. The name you're likely less familiar with, because it's a brand new company, is the Alabama Prison Transformation Partnership. It is a conglomeration of several organizations, including the Harbert Construction Company, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, out of Birmingham, that was created specifically for this task. They are going to be building 3 prisons in Bibb County, Elmore County, and Escambia counties. And if any of you live in any of those counties, or you work in any of those counties, or you care about people in those counties and you want to organize around these prisons, please let us know. We will give you our contact information. There is an organizing effort happening already in Bibb County, specifically in Briarfield, Alabama. There was a community meeting Sunday before last. Briarfield has about 800 to 1,000 people, and there are 150 people at this meeting. Those folks are not happy to hear that the governor has been planning for weeks and months now to build a secret mega private prison in her backyard, in their backyard. So what's the problem with this plan, right? We've spent the last 30 minutes telling you about how terrible all of Alabama's prisons are. Why do we have a problem with this plan? I think that's the question that we get most frequently, and there are several answers to that question. I have a feeling that's one of the questions in the Q&A right now. First, you know, I think that we should always defer to the responses of currently incarcerated people when it comes to that question. And the response that we hear most frequently is that building new prisons always provides opportunities to put more people into prison, right? Historically, when more prisons are built, more people are put inside of them. And that is not what we want in Alabama. Second, new prisons will not solve the issues with corruption and violence and abuse at ADOC. These new prisons that are going to be built won't be ready for another 2, 3, 4 years. What is the state of Alabama going to do with this absolute crisis that is on our hands currently? This is, you know, an opportunity to create a diversion from the actual problems at hand. The actual problems at hand are mass incarceration. They are harsh sentencing laws, they are over-incarceration, and they are racial disparities in sentencing. And that is not what brand new private prisons, brand new for-profit opportunities to benefit from incarceration are going to solve. Dillon, anything you want to add to that on this one before we move on from prison construction?
Yeah, I mean, you really, I think, hit it out of the park. I just, you know, would add that the thing is like we have to make a decision at some point, and we've covered over just the last 5 or 6 years a number of really kind of solid efforts that have outlined detailed recommendations, have kind of given the state guidance on approaches that they could take. None of them have included prison construction. Not a single recommendation has. And Katie touched on this too, but even those who are actually inside those facilities right now, and we have reporters on our team who talk to these folks often, not a single one I know from our side has ever said that they support more prison construction. And I think it comes back to, we have to make a decision as a state at some point about this topic of mass incarceration. If we are really actually interested in solving it, if we're actually really dedicated to doing something about it, there is no way that building more prisons actually demonstrates that, especially in lieu of actually a solid or a serious attempts or commitments to pursuing any of the range of reforms of which we've talked about so far. And we still, I got to tell y'all, we got a whole nother DOJ report to touch on before we wrap this up. And so it's just, it really comes down to this, well, why not, construction situation really comes down to hasn't ever been an attempt to actually do anything besides just build our way out of this. Katie started off by talking about how a lot of what we will be covering in these last few years are really a snapshot of what we would have seen back in the 70s and the 80s, and even prior to that. And so the exact same thing is happening right now. We're deferring to construction as a way to build ourselves out of this problem, instead of actually deferring to the real reforms that we know are proactive and actually or reconciliatory to this problem that's been created. And so, yeah, thank you though for touching on that, Katie. I'm gonna go on to the 2020 DOJ report, because yes, there is another. That means two within a 2-year span of time. And again, under U.S. Attorney General William Barr, which I'm sure is surprising for some folks listening. This report also spanned over 30 pages, and it outlined instances of violence and abuse incarcerated people face at the hands of ADOC correctional officers. I've got to say that I think a lot of the content of this report were probably more well known to us than maybe some of the things that we had seen in the first one, because these are unfortunately stories that we hear and see often. I know our investigative reporter, Beth Shelburne, has a number of stories that you all can find out there that detail the type of abuse or brutality that people on the inside are facing, or even just negligence, medical negligence that means that they're not getting the treatment that they are literally constitutionally entitled to. So this report also stated that these uses of excessive force included the use of batons, chemical spray, physical brutality such as kicking, and has resulted in serious injuries and even sometimes deaths of the abused, despite the fact that these findings were consistent with the first reports, which did touch on some of this and also underscored the routine violation of Eighth Amendment rights of those incarcerated. ADOC stated that this was a quote unquote orchestrated attempt to hinder the progress made by their department to address the longstanding challenges facing the correctional system. But that's interesting because the first report again came out in April of 2019. ADOC was not, I think, unaware that they were under investigation in the lead up to that report. And yet, those 2015 reforms, I noted, were not things that they really saw through or that they committed to seriously. Again, they had an opportunity in 2019 after that report was delivered and the legislature was actually convened at that time to say, we're going to make this a priority. We've got to do something before we leave this building. It didn't happen. They didn't come back in 2019 for a special session. And then in 2020, we were back in the building with these issues back on the table, this study group having just released a set of recommendations, and yet we didn't get anything done and passed before the legislature shut down for COVID-19. And frankly, we were still having discussions at that time about more robust reforms that had not been filed and were going to be necessary. And so I'm going to pass along to Katie to talk about what we expect for 2021, but this remains and has remained an urgent and pressing issue. And yet we are sitting here talking to you all on September 23rd of 2020. We will have, in April, we'll have been up on 2 years since the first DOJ report. And, if the legislature does not make this a top priority coming in 2021, we will still have just been kicking the can for now a few years.
So just very quickly, so that we can get to some good Q&A, what's going to happen in legislative session 2020? If I knew the answer to that, I could make a lot of money for all of us here. Nobody knows. I think some things that we can rely on, some COVID recovery bills, probably around small business, probably around unemployment, because the state's unemployment fund is quickly being depleted. We are already seeing legislation for protection for law enforcement officers, prosecution of protesters, prosecution of people who are protesting around statues and monuments, like came out of Florida this week. I think we'll probably see some of that here. There were pieces of business immunity legislation at the end of last session that they tried to push through that we'll likely see here. What that means is protecting your work when you get sick because they don't take care of you. We've seen those attempts at the federal level. We'll probably see those here too. Whether or not we'll get real movement on prisons is, I think, a real guess. Whether or not legislators decide that they're tired of the government or the governor circumventing them, whether or not this rises to the occasion is, certainly our job to convince them. There are enough legislators who have, good committee assignments who are real pissed about what's happening in parole that hopefully something can be done about that. We have coalition partners like the Alabama Justice Initiative who are really leading the charge on that issue, LaTanya Tate, who have been raising the alarm on parole for quite some time. But whether or not large scale, massive criminal justice and prison reform bills are pushed through in 2021, especially after a contentious presidential election, I think is a hard guess, and we'll see. So with that, I think Dillon and I agreed that we'd start going through the Q&A. Stacy asked if we could give a plug of how to get involved. Dillon, do you want to give some thoughts on that?
Sure. So I'll start by saying, first of all, that Katie and I, kind of live and breathe state legislative policy work. However, that is not the only avenue by any means to advocate on, issues of criminal justice reform. You can start at even more local level, talk to your DAs, talk to judges. Those are also elected positions, I should point out. You should also, think about your own role that you can take on, the way we think about how we are kind of entrenched in this system of criminal punishment. And so we make decisions, I think, all the time that only further reinforce the system. And so, do the work, think about all of those things. But in terms of a state legislative advocacy framework, I would say, the state legislature, we don't know what will happen in 2021 around who will be allowed in the building because of COVID-19. But you can start right now by reaching out to your local state lawmakers, those are your state senators and state representatives in your districts. Right now, I think is a good time. We usually encourage people to, while they're in district, I ask them to come and have a meeting with them. I mean, you are really close and proximate to these individuals. And so, they probably, some of them probably have kids that go to school with your kids. They attend the same church as you. You're in a similar community group, whatever it may be. Ask them to sit down with you, I guess right now, or even Zoom with you, to have some of these conversations about these pressing issues. Ask them what their points and perspectives are on these. Challenge them with your own, right? Write to them as well. And then a lot of our organizations put out these action alerts and action forms that you can fill out and kind of help you get messages directly to their inboxes. So always stay checking out our pages and looking for that information. And we will kind of give you kind of like a guidepost as to like what is right now pressing. Are we about to come up on a committee meeting? Are we about to come up on final passage? And we really need your voices to help us push it through. And so there's lots of opportunities, those ways to plug in. But again, we don't know what will happen yet with who's allowed in 2021 into the building. But when we do know, we'll be sure to also put out that information. And we always encourage people to get into that building if they can and talk directly to lawmakers and sit in those committee meetings with Katie and I, which are usually really empty, and let them know that you're there and that you're watching. Legislators assume that no one's really paying attention except for us in the press most of the time. So they need to see you and to feel you and to hear you.
Let's get into some Q&A. So starting on the prison strike, I think this is a great question about how folks were able to spread the word nationally about the prison strike. I think I would just quickly put a plug in for the Free Alabama Movement website. They have got a great record of all of their work, but definitely a firsthand account of how these strikes operated. There are organizers, incarcerated organizers who were there on the ground during this work who can tell you exactly how it happened. Dillon, I don't know if you read any of those accounts that you'd like to give any feedback on how that worked while I pull the website.
Sure, yeah, I would also defer people to the site. I honestly don't know specifics about how they spread the word, but I think, these are organizers who have their own really creative interwoven networks. And just like we organize out here in our own lanes, they are able to do the same to accomplish their goals on the inside. That's sometimes writing to one another, making phone calls to one another, having family members talk to another family member of someone else in another state or place. And so, they're really savvy, and these are again, these are real people who are locked up right now who have a lot to contribute back in their own communities with those skills, frankly.
Awesome. Thanks, Dillon. So Sarah had asked about the 2019 and 2020 DOJ reports, whether or not anything had been done since then. I think the question is meh. And what incarcerated people can do if they feel like their rights have been violated. And Sarah, I think that's a really hard question because unfortunately there's sometimes not a lot of recourse. There are a few class action lawsuits, which is a lawsuit that takes place when a lot of people's rights have been violated, and oftentimes an organization takes on the case on behalf of people whose rights have been violated. And frankly, sometimes those lawsuits are very flawed. Those individuals don't necessarily get damages, which is money. They don't necessarily have influence on the direction that the case goes. There isn't the type of legal maneuvering that can take place if, Dillon hits me and I decide to sue him and I have a lot of influence over the way that the case works. And there just isn't the type of broad legal allowances for currently incarcerated people that we see in some other areas of the law, at least not the way that it operates sometimes. Dillon, what would you say?
Yeah, there are people on the inside who are becoming legal scholars themselves. They go to the library, they study, they sometimes do their own filings, or they reach out to people who can help them. And so it's unfortunate because, again, because of their position, they really just don't have the same recourse. Now, what I will say is that, these DOJ reports, once they're delivered, they say that there's that basically the state has 49 days to respond, and with actual action, not just words. And, while both of these reports have come out in the last 2 years, which is really important, the truth is that DOJ has really shown no interest in moving forward with really pressing the state to do anything. So even though now the 2019 report has been out for a year and a half almost, there's been nothing to be done about that. The governor formed that study group. I told you about how that went, and there was no real commitment to seeing anything through from the legislature or from DOJ. And so we're still in the same boat, and there's been no lawsuits filed against the Alabama Department of Corrections by the federal government or any takeover of the facilities, which are potential options for DOJ.
And we only have 8 minutes left, so I'm going to acknowledge we're not going to get to all 23 questions, so apologies in advance if we pick around some. If we don't get to your question, I'm so sorry. A question about whether or not people of color are sentenced more harshly than white people convicted of the same crimes. I think this is a really important question, so I would like to answer this one. Dillon, do you want to go first, and then I will go?
No, you go for it. I feel like you probably know more on this one, actually.
Yeah, so I want to talk first about marijuana specifically. So in the state of Alabama, the sentencing around marijuana for Black people versus white people is incredibly disparate. For example, I don't know, I was about to say, is anybody here from Huntsville? Because that's what I always do when I'm in a classroom, but I can't see any of you. So if you're from Huntsville, just raise your hand in your room. Thank you to the person who just raised their hand. So you are 10 times more likely to have a harsher charge or sentencing in Huntsville for the same marijuana charge as a white person. There is an entire report that I will link in the chat. This is a very helpful thing about Zoom calls that we did with Alabama Appleseed about Alabama's failed war on marijuana. We spend about $20 million every year prosecuting low-level marijuana offenses that are not a threat to community safety and are also a direct pipeline to filling up Alabama's prisons and jails with people who don't need to be there. And there is also a direct correlation with disparate sentencing for Black and white folks. We also mentioned that there are racial disparities in parole rates in Alabama. If you look at HFOA as well, I put the link in the chat to the one-pager on the Alabama Habitual Felony Offender Act. There are racial disparities in the way that sentencing works around HFOA. Beth Shelburne, Dillon's colleague, has done some good reporting on this. So the short answer is yes. And the disparities are clearest amongst Black men and white men in Alabama. And I would be glad to, once I stop talking, to go find you some actual evidence other than my rambling. Dillon, do you want to pick a question while I do that? Or Stacy, were you going to say something? Or did you just come off video? Okay, Dillon, you want to say something?
Sure. I see a question about veterans courts. Why aren't the courts recognizing these veterans courts? And we know that they would help decrease the population. Someone mentioned that their husband is in prison for 16 years for a technical violation, and they really need mental health care in a veterans court in Houston County. I mean, I couldn't agree more. I just say that. We just talked about, that they need to be much more widely implemented, and there really needs to be, they need to be a part of the equation in every situation when you've got veterans, people struggling with mental health, people who are indigent. All of these are things that lead people into these pipelines towards, the incarceration system. It's not this kind of quote unquote criminal activity that people try to make it out to be. And so, so it should be more widely available. Someone asked who is the rehabilitative commissioner. That bill was not passed. And to my knowledge, no one has, the ADOC did not take it upon themselves to appoint someone to that position. Do you know anything about that, Katie?
I don't. And I think we're about to have to wrap up based on the chat we just got. I just want to say very briefly, somebody asked about the school to prison pipeline. We can give you our contact information in the chat as we're wrapping up. I think it's incredibly important to note that this is all interconnected. One thing we hear from incarcerated folks a lot that we work with is how many folks that they know who first were, arrested at their schools and ended up in a juvenile facility and now are in an adult facility. So just wanted to elevate that question and say I would love to talk to folks more about that because that's something that we work on quite a bit. So I will put my email in the chat if anyone wants to follow up about any of these issues.
Yeah, and a number of questions I see are folks I know looking for some details or things that they can share and everything like that. I just would encourage you again to check out SPLC and ACLU of Alabama's websites. We also have a Smart Justice page at the ACLU called Alabama Smart Justice.org. And so go to these pages, and I wish we had even more time to spend with you all to cover everything, because we could talk about this truly all day and probably for a couple of days. But it's a lot of information that we do have out there that you all can take, and we really put it together. Our comms teams are amazing. They put it together so that you all can use it and share it. So please check that out. And I'll also add my email in the chat for anyone who wants to follow up.
Okay, so that concludes our time that we have today. I want to express our thanks again from all of the people who sponsored this panel today. Thank you to the well over 100 people who participated in this. And it's really encouraging for me to see that people are interested in this topic, engaged with this topic, and hopefully we can actually make some progress on this topic over the next year into the next legislative session. So thank you so much. I encourage any of you watching this to reach out to Katie and to Dillon and find ways to plug into your local communities. You all have contacts that you may not even realize that you have, and having your voice be an advocate for these issues is sometimes more impactful even than having someone who's tied to an organization. So thank you. Goodbye. Have a great day.